a variety of a variety of other different places, and find them speaking opportunities in American high schools. So they go in, they talk to these high school students about their experiences in their home countries, their immigration process to the US, and then also their experience in their new home country in the United States, sort of comparing and contrasting the two. Additionally, I am a writer. I've written for outlets like the National Review, Reason Magazine, and the Washington Examiner, just to name a few, and write about politics and culture and religion. And I am an apprentice to a theologian in New York City as well. So sort of wearing a myriad of different hats.
Wow. So glad to have you with us. So we're really here to talk about today the U.S. election, upcoming election, and how it will resonate with us Israelis as well, because we have a lot of skin in this game. But
Yeah.
also we want to hear about you guys. What policies you think are most important or more controversial this time around? What do you think is going to play a major part, because it's very, very close? So what do you really think it's going to be about for Americans? And then we'll really chew down on policies towards Israel.
Sure. Sounds great. So I can sort of um, take you guys through just, how the election is looking right now in terms of like the points and the way that all of the swing states are looking. And then we can go sort of into the way that I think this might impact global relationships and international relations. But so first of all, just want to say thank you to Nitsan and Anna for having me today. Very excited to be here. Um, According to the national polling average, the Pew national polling average, it looks like Trump is actually up on Kamala by just a tiny, tiny bit. It's actually 48.4 to 48.1. So we're looking at actually a dead heat here. In the battleground states, we're looking at Trump up 2 in Georgia, up 1.4 in North Carolina, up 2.4 in Arizona, and there's a good shot that he also picks up Nevada. That would bring him to 268 electoral college votes. Now, if he were to lose the other battleground states, he'd lose 270 to 268. So I just want to give you guys really a look into how close this election actually is. This is insane. We're sort of on the edge of our seats over here. Republicans, for the first time, are really embracing early voting. So we're seeing a huge turnout for Republicans in this sort of early stage, which is something that we've never seen before. But I'm cautious to put too much weight on that. We'll see what happens on November 5th. It's really way too early to tell. As far as morale goes in the United States, I've seen two camps, right? And I think you can see this sort of during any election season. People generally fall into two factions. It's either number one, desperation. This election for us is the end of democracy. It's the most important election of our lifetimes. It's, blah, blah, blah. And on the other side, you have an understanding that the United States government is actually a system of checks and balances that will keep democracy afloat regardless of whoever wins this election. And that's really the camp that I fall into, right? The idea that this is not the end of democracy. It might be the start of a very different 4 years, a very different administration, who's to say. I think this election has the capability to have significant impacts in terms of foreign policy, in terms of economic policy, in terms of healthcare policy, in terms of immigration. But again, it will never be the end of democracy. So that's how we're feeling over here. I'm really excited also to hear from the Israeli crowd how you guys are feeling about this at the end during the Q&A. I'd love to know a little bit more about the public perception over there.
I actually totally agree. And it's kind of the same here with our election. And we've had a bunch of them. Like, if there's a difference, is that we can have an election like every 2 years and on average, and you guys really stick to your systems. But in both cases, it's like some people just think it's the end of the world, or somebody that was elected into office can just change everything, and it's usually not the case because, and especially for the United States, which has been around for a long time, but even for us, I mean, you can see usually people think it will be much, much worse than it actually is, and also that it will change much, much more than it actually changes, because
Yeah.
it's very difficult to really get policy going that is so different than what has been, especially if there are large traditions. But really, do you see like one major issue? And I'm just gonna have a short disclaimer, because we're part of an organization that accepts everyone. Ladies of Liberty Alliance, we are not partisan. I'm not gonna not state my personal opinions or preferences, but you totally can. It's open. So but we're here to hear from about both sides and just really and about in relation to Israel. So what is the main or like three main issues you see as the big ones on this upcoming election for inner US policies?
Yeah, I think this is interesting. The major issues I think would probably include immigration. Immigration, I think, is really at the top of people's lists in terms of the importance of the issue. It's really it's a crisis sort of unlike we've ever seen before. And being in New York City, you can really see that in real time. The way that, during COVID, during 2020, the public schools in New York, several of which I had actually been inside of, and a couple of which I had done work in, were, the gymnasiums were cleared out in order to house migrants during that period of time. There are, migrant shelters around the city. Times Square has really been infiltrated, and you've seen an elevation in crime in New York City as well. And you see that, obviously along the border. The numbers are crazy. People estimate that there are 10 million, upwards of 10 million illegal immigrants living in the United States right now. So that's a complicated issue. It's an issue that is on everyone's minds, and an issue that the Democrats have acknowledged is important to the American people, and has really always been a part of the Republican Party platform. As for other issues, I think obviously the economy, inflation is huge. Friends and family have been unable to afford groceries. We've seen huge inflation in grocery prices and prices of just everyday goods for the American. We can also see the way that is influencing the housing market. How housing is becoming generally unaffordable for the American people. And then, of course, I think you'll see people talk about abortion as a big issue as well. And that sort of falls under the healthcare banner. So, right, healthcare is incredibly important. Revamping healthcare is incredibly important in the United States because the system is really broken. But abortion is still a major issue. It's, I would say, still in the top three issues that people are thinking about. It's shifted, right? Because we saw in the election in 2022, we presumed that there would be a real red wave, right? That Republicans would sort of take seats with alacrity. They didn't, because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so, just to take you guys through the numbers, again, according to Pew, in August of 2020, fewer than half of the voters, I would say the voter, like 40%, said abortion was an important issue to their votes. At the time, it was Trump voters at 46% were more likely than Biden voters to say that it mattered a great deal to them. And this was, I think, 35-ish% on the Biden side. And then following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, again, the sort of the dynamic has shifted. And now today, 67% of Harris voters call this this issue very important to them. And so that's nearly, obviously double the share of Biden voters who said that 4 years ago. And so I think those are probably the three main issues that we'll see at the fore of the United States election.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you tied it in with healthcare because I also view abortions as sort of a medical issue, but it's part of the debate. Like some people, I mean, I think even if a person is pro-life, and I can see how someone would be, but it's still, but even if you are, you should look at as a medical decision. Sometimes you have to let doctors decide about it, especially regarding miscarriages and not even abortions at will. So it's a very important issue. Like Israel is a very pro-choice country, even though we're a very religious country. And if you would ask a lot of people, they would probably be closer to the pro-life views. But if you ask them who should be the one to decide, they would say the woman and her doctor. And if there's any threat to the woman's not only life but well-being, then it's okay and it's legal. That's how it is in this state. Like if you're super religious, it will probably not be your choice, but they would say, yeah, there should be a choice, and it should be a doctor's choice. That's how. But so it is. I think it is a medical issue, and it's really tied in with the healthcare. And I also think also Republicans. Trump, for example, he said he's gonna revoke Obamacare, but he's also gonna have a better plan because he can't just say I'm gonna throw it out. He has to say, but we can do better, and I'm gonna do better because people are not having it the way it was before.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too and we can talk a little bit about abortion now if that works for you, but just the idea that the Republican Party platform, the tent, has been broadened so much. You've seen the tent broadened so much during this, particular election cycle that the Republican Party platform has actually shifted quite a bit in terms of its abortion policies. Because we saw in 2022, Republicans recognize, oh, this is not a winning issue for us. Like it might be a really deeply important moral issue for us, but in terms of winning votes specifically of single white women, which, we've seen become a real and important and influential voter bloc. It's important for us to understand that politically we need to broaden our policy a bit. So they've now, included Vance and Trump have included in their party platform, exceptions for cases of rape and incest and life of the mother, and they're talking about protections for IVF as well. And so we've seen the Republicans really widen that tent. As far as the Democrats go, I think it's interesting because you used to have two parties at the polls. I think the Republicans are polling more centrist now, and you have a Democrat Party that's advocating for, in many cases, abortion up to 9 months, which is not necessarily a popular policy proposal either. And so we'll see how all of that goes and how important election genuinely is to the American public at the voting booth.
Yeah, that's it. It's really interesting. And I wanted to ask about the Libertarian Party because you don't really hear that voice that much, and I think our viewers are more inclined to agree. So what role does it play, actually, particularly Chase Oliver? What is he playing? What role, if any, is he playing in this election? How does he impact anything, any of the views, any of the platforms? Because so I want to regard and get into our main topic is U.S.-Israeli relations. You can talk about that too.
Totally. Yeah. So I think probably the most productive way to go about this is I'll share a little bit about Chase Oliver's platform, and then I'll go through, the ways that we might see the libertarians actually have a significant sway in the United States elections. And then from there, I'll go into his stances on Israel and the war in Gaza. So his platform is interesting. He's interesting. He has been called by Rolling Stone the most influential libertarian in the United States. And that, is sort of a huge statement. He is 39. He never went to college, instead opting to go sort of straight into the service workforce. And he is a Christian who describes himself as armed and gay. So a huge, a huge tent here of people that he is appealing to. A quote that he has about his campaign is from May 2024. It says, "We are going to wake up millions of people. We're going to bring them into the tent and say that if you are living your life in peace, without violence, force, fraud, coercion, or theft, your life is your life. Your body is your body. Your business is your business, and your property is your property. It's not mine, and it sure as hell isn't the federal government." So I think in terms of covering sort of the libertarian ideology, the platform, he does pretty well. I'll give you sort of an overview of the different pillars of his platform. He doesn't support speech codes or safe spaces. He values, he's a self-professed advocate for free speech and open discourse. He has focused on a real sort of anti-establishment ethos. He wants to remove taxation and government coercion as much as possible on all levels. He talks about, ending tariffs, which he calls, I think, economic protectionism, the last I heard. And that adds to the cost, obviously, is what he says of everyday Americans. It's less about the sort of consequences for our adversaries across the world, but instead that the economic burden will fall on the everyday American, which I actually think he's right about. So yeah, and he talks about slashing. Go ahead, Nissan. What were you gonna say?
No, absolutely, you're right, and it's a numbers game, and
It is.
I mean, somebody should say, I'm right wing. I absolutely agree. We should have sanctions for countries that support terrorism or anything like that. But tariffs usually fall on the consumer.
Right.
It's a numbers game. Eventually, that's what's gonna happen. So, and they're not always smart, and you have to do them the right way.
Right. 100%. So it's I am aligned with him sort of in this way. Although I don't think that ending tariffs is a great idea, but I do think he's seeing it right on an economic level. Slashing. He talks about slashing the size and scope of the federal workforce, a la Milei. He reminds me. I was watching a couple of videos of him, and he reminds me of the Milei clip, which is "afuera, afuera, afuera," slashing all of the government agencies. He wants to abolish Social Security. He wants to eliminate the DOE. He wants to do as much as he can to eliminate welfare. And he's actually running, which I think is interesting, running with a Hayekian libertarian economist, Mike Termott. So that's a very interesting pairing. He doesn't want to build a wall on the southern border. He's against Trump's, infamous border wall. And he advocates for, free immigration and reforms to the government-run vetting process that we've seen a lot of problems with over the past few years. But anyone who isn't a criminal, he thinks should, be able to come freely. And he also recently talked about something that I mentioned earlier in the sort of core issues in this election, which is the rising cost in home ownership, which is a big focus where Democratic voters specifically have expressed frustration. He wants to make current student loans interest-free and get them off of the government dole. He thinks that we should completely get rid of the Federal Reserve, which he believes would help stabilize the country and reduce bureaucracy. He was originally a Democrat, which is interesting, and he has messaged sort of to distinguish himself from Harris largely on economic issues. In terms of his influence in U.S. politics and the influence of the Libertarian Party more specifically, Oliver is really interesting, and this is actually why the Rolling Stone called him the most influential libertarian in the United States, because he's already made a pretty big political dent in one of the most closely watched swing states in any election in my lifetime. So he's from Atlanta, and he ran for Georgia's 5th congressional district in 2020. And then 2 years later, he ran for the Senate, and he actually prompted a high enough vote count to send Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker into a runoff election. And so, that was a huge deal on the national scale and caused implications nationally as well. And when we look at the current election, grabbing like even half of that support on a presidential level could help change the trajectory of election day, given that Georgia is such an important state. And so the gap is really incredibly narrow here. The polls are showing right now the state holding a 1.4 percentage point gap between Trump and Harris, with Trump at 48.8% compared to Harris's 47.4%. So, beyond Georgia, he's running as this libertarian. It's the most popular third party offering in American politics. He will be on all 50 ballots. He'll be, on the ballot in 47 states, and then a write-in candidate in 3 states. And then, if we look at elections past, we can see the Libertarian Party's sort of sway in national elections. There is a precedent for libertarians gaining ground in Pennsylvania, which is a huge state in the election. In 2016, for example, if you guys remember Gary Johnson, he won nearly 150,000 votes in the state. And then in Michigan, he earned more than 170,000 votes in the state. And both states had really tiny margins deciding the results. And so, yeah, that's a huge opportunity for libertarians to sway the outcome of this election. In terms of Chase Oliver and his Israel perspective and his perspective on foreign relations and our allies across the globe, he is as isolationist as he can possibly be, right? So he talks about pulling funding from nearly all of our allies across the world, and he also talks about shutting down all of our military bases in foreign countries. So that is a fairly radical perspective on foreign relations. Just to read a quote about Israel that Oliver said a few weeks ago. He said, Israel has a right to respond to the October 7th terrorist attacks, but the nature of their response has been, quote unquote, very, very bad. They've been conducting airstrikes, killing tens of thousands of people. Really, he said, this should have been a more surgical attack against Hamas. Instead of a scalpel, they used a sledgehammer. And he goes on to say, being a friend to Israel means that airstrikes in the region will only create more animosity. As a friend to Israel, we need to be friendly enough to say, hey, this isn't the best way to go about this. That's what friends do, is what he says. When they see a friend doing something wrong, they stop them and say, hey, let's talk about this. So he advocates for a ceasefire in Gaza. He advocates for a 2-state solution. And he advocates for removing our funding and our military footprint from, this region of the world and every other.
Yeah. So about that, libertarians typically worry about government spending, but the thing about U.S. foreign aid specifically towards Israel and a few other military-aligned allies is that it goes back into U.S. economy. The way it works usually is we get funds, few $billion, tens of billions every year to be exact, but most of it you have to only buy U.S. manufactured weapons or even a textile, whatever you need to use. And also we assist in sometimes R&D of those weapons, and we can only sell the patents back to the US or to whoever by contract to allies of the US, and we're also sometimes limited by contract by how we are allowed to use it. So that's why these are interest-based a cooperation more than having a buddy or a little brother you have to help out from now and then. It really is very much very much a common interest, as well as having bases on. Usually, when one country has a base in another country, it's the other country that's giving up a small part, but a part of its sovereignty to that
Right.
other country, telling them, yeah, you can camp out here because we know we're allies, and if you need to get places fast.
Right.
Regarding this particular war, I think we went about it as surgically as we can. We
And look,
really, we really
I
tried.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'll clarify my own personal position. I have seen, I mean, look, I'm not on the ground in Israel by any means, but I've seen nothing but like surgical and miraculous uh techniques being employed by Israel. Like really incredible, really incredible, I mean, down to the beepers. Uh, really incredible tactics being employed and nothing but, a real desire to supply humanitarian aid to those in Gaza. I think, the Palestinian people are languishing under the jackboot of a terrorist regime. And so warfare is difficult and warfare is tragic. But in my opinion, and from my perspective, Israel has done all it can to fight a moral war.
Yeah, we really do the best we can in all regards. And I can't really go into my position because it is classified, but I do have something to do with target acquisition and also evacuation of uninvolved population. So I do know a little bit. We really do the best we can, and we are also limited in how much we can share to the world. So
Yeah.
also the press doesn't always paint a very accurate picture. It also depends where you get your information from.
Can
But
I
and
ask, can I ask you a question
yeah,
about that? If you So two questions actually. Number one, what are the underreported stories in terms of Israel's philanthropy and morality when it comes to this war that you wish you saw more in the mainstream media? And number two, what sources would you recommend people be reading when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
okay. So something I would really like to be more out there is the amount of food going into Gaza every day. About 6,000 calories per person per day going into Gaza by aid provided by Israel, which is more than we're required to do. And also we've encountered a lot of difficulties getting it past the Egypt controlled part of the border, and we've found go arounds. And if you remember, the U.S. aided in supplying a whole floating like harbor thing, but they wouldn't have, which didn't end up ending so well. But they wouldn't have to do that if people who are supposed to be allies of both the U.S. and the Palestinians made it easier for goods to come in. And as far as information goes, it's just really problematic because a lot of the media, I think, is tainted, including some of the Israeli media. Uh, but really, just the most accurate people would be the IDF spokesperson. Just really try not. I mean, every information out there online you should take with a grain of salt, but they really do have a lot of information which you can fact check easily. And you have Daniel Hagari, which is the chief spokesman. He went, risked his life. He's a former combat officer, so he's in a very in a like kind of our Navy SEALs, I think he was, and something like that. But he actually went down into warfare areas, went down to the tunnels, showed the world, took videos of how the hostages were held, how they were treated, how they were executed for no reason. And I don't know, that did not get as much didn't go as viral as some other stuff from the pro-Pali people on the online. And so, I mean, of course, everybody has an agenda, but we can back our facts, at least we can back them up.
Yeah.
And if anybody's really into, like, most people don't know a lot about international law. Like I was very disappointed with John Oliver when he has this whole half comedy, but he has a large audience. And when he did a bit like, if you collapse a building, that's a war crime. That's just not true. I mean, it's
Right.
not true. If you go to Wikipedia and look up humanitarian law or war crime, I mean, you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be a lawyer.
Right.
You can just look it up in Wikipedia, and it's right there.
And
When
Israel is telling people to evacuate. They're dropping
Yeah,
knock bombs, they're dropping pamphlets, they're just
exactly.
imploring people to get out of the area before
There
these things
are
happen.
conditions during modern warfare, and that you will have to collapse buildings, and there are
Yeah.
ways you can do it, uh, which do not constitute a war crime. So just and it's always sad. It's always sad that people lose their homes and have to evacuate. A lot of Israelis are evacuated too, from the north and from the south. They've been evacuated for over a year. But we have a modern government that takes care of its civilians. So they're living in hotels. They're getting, if they found independent housing, then they get like some of the rent back. Not all of it, but so because that's what the regime is supposed to do. And if the Lebanese regime, and if Gaza is not even a real regime, if they're ruled by a terrorist organization, then yeah, they don't get that stuff.
Mm.
And we try to do as much as we can in form of humanitarian aid, in form of abiding with international law, and it's not resonating enough. I mean, I think it is with the decision makers. So at least that. I mean, that's why when I said earlier we're both optimists. Like, I don't think, no matter who wins, I don't think Trump or Harris really do get all their information from the news. It was like, when Trump was president last time, people said, oh, yeah, he makes decisions based off Fox News. Well, I don't think that's probably not true.
That's really
There
true,
is
right?
there is still diplomacy going on, and so the decision makers, we do share that information. Also, obviously, they get more classified information, and they do know what's going on, but they also have their base. They have to uphold their base, and that's the problem with all politics. So yeah, so um, I would like for people to be more aware of it, but I do to an extent try to trust public officials, that they can listen to their advisors and be more well informed than the general public, even if they're not experts in anything.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, what do you think? Do you think that the election really will change Israeli-U.S. relationship, like depending on who wins?
Well, it's hard to say. And I think maybe we can start by sort of outlining what the relationship between Israel and the United States looks like in terms of like foreign aid and what's coming into Israel from the United States. And then we can talk a little bit more about the relationship and the way that that might shift moving forward. Because there are, very real possibilities of change here. But so generally speaking, U.S. foreign aid will serve two purposes, and we've talked about this a little bit, Nitzan. The idea that we're either bolstering a key ally's defense capabilities against terrorist threats, which is really what's happening here, and we're also, on the other hand, fortifying U.S. geopolitical interests in a certain volatile region, and so in the Middle East, obviously, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and the only country that is promoting Western Judeo-Christian values. And I'm not sure what you guys think about that term Judeo-Christian, and we can talk about that a little bit as well. But obviously, Israel is constantly under attack and needs and deserves our support. And so it's been the cumulative recipient of about $310 billion in foreign aid from the United States. That is, that largely outpaces the number two country, which is Egypt, which has received less than half of that amount of money. But again, I really don't understand the idea that people would call this like free money. I've heard that from, we've discussed that a little bit, but I've heard that from other parties. Israel is our ally. and our biggest ally in the Middle East, and to an extent, you do our dirty work, right? Like so that American men and women don't have to be deployed. There are fewer boots on the ground because Israel does what it does. And I might say it does it much better and for much cheaper than we could, right? So I was watching in August as Israel was knocking off terrorist after terrorist, what, like 20 leaders that are on the FBI, that were on the FBI most wanted list. That would have cost us trillions of dollars in terms of counterinsurgency and intelligence and armament. And so the fact that people can call this free money, that we're just sort of like shoveling over to Israel, is really misinformed. I do want to highlight just another sort of aid package so that you guys know sort of an up-to-date report about the sorts of money that's going into Israel. In 2016, under the Trump administration, the Israeli government signed their third 10-year memorandum of understanding with the United States. And so the US is pledged to provide $38 billion in military aid. This is from the fiscal year 2019 through fiscal year 2028. So that includes 33 billion in foreign military financing and then an additional $5 billion in missile defense appropriations. So that's sort of the current deal that we have right now. Obviously, that's been bolstered since October 7th of last year. As far as changes in the upcoming election cycle, Trump has openly said that aid to Israel is essential, and he will continue to fund it. Although I do think that Trump views the United States government as a business, right? So he ran it largely as a business in his administration, and sees this sort of symbiotic relationship between the two countries, between our two countries. Harris is interesting. We're really not sure the way that she'll sort of fall. In her first interview on the topic, right, she said that there would be no change in policy from the Biden administration. I think the Biden administration itself is interesting because after the October 7th attacks, Biden came out very strongly in favor of Israel doing what it needed to do in order to put Hamas in the ground. And then as the sort of public opinion shifted, and we noted the public opinion shifting, his rhetoric shifted as well. That didn't change necessarily any of the funding that was going over into Israel or any of the military armament that was going into Israel, but it did cause a significant rift, I think, between the two governments, and the relationship there is still relatively shaky. And Nitzan, you can comment on this as well, as if you're seeing this to be true to form from your side of things. But Harris is interesting. She's also talked about withholding weapons to Israel and to our other allies, and so that's something that is concerning to me, to say the least. And then obviously Oliver, I think, would probably be an unmitigated disaster, just in terms of our foreign policy. Again, to withdraw all foreign aid, to end all tariffs, and then to begin to close all of our military bases around the globe would just absolutely kneecap United States power, and I think be the beginning of the end for our country. So I'm glad he's the Libertarian candidate. Yeah, but that's how I
to sway public opinion just a little bit, just kind of in further of libertarian values as well as freedoms. I like how you said like he did. I remember him saying that he's an armed gay man. So like there's a meme, a very famous meme about libertarians, which I identify with, like people seeing me be pro guns, pro choice, pro drugs. Obviously not actually pro drugs, but pro legalization of drugs. Like I don't think the criminal justice system is always the cure. And I say this as a former cop and prosecutor. It's not always when you have a hammer, like everything's a nail, but addiction is not always a nail. So
right.
So I love that meme because a lot of times libertarians find themselves being at odds with both parties on some major issue. And this is
Yeah.
kind of the thing with Oliver. Like I would love free markets. I would love cutting government funds. I would love lower taxes.
Yeah.
I'm tariffs should be very limited, in my opinion. But obviously, if he won't get enough real power to make a difference, but people really should see the cooperation if they want the US to have to keep on. It's not being the world's cop, it's being the world's leader. It's being the leader of the free world. If the US president is to be perceived as the leader of the free world, then you have to have that power over people. You have to have armed forces. You have to, for Biden's don't to mean something, he backed it up with a
Right.
warship because you can't do it otherwise. I mean, you can't cut yourself off.
Yeah, and I can talk a little bit about power projection as well because I do think that that's like remarkably important when it comes to the way that we're conducting international relations. It's another area where I worry about both parties, frankly. I think Trump was much more successful in the Middle East, and we saw that in practice through the Abraham Accords. But he projected a sense of unpredictability, right? And everybody was a little bit nervous that he had the nuclear football, a little bit nervous. And then on the other hand, you have a president that is seen as like doddering and senile, and I don't know where he is, frankly. I haven't seen him in weeks, other than to do like quick pressers that, are staged and, answer questions that are, specifically chosen by his aides. Um, and I can say with confidence, I was speaking to my friend Miriam Waba at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies about this, actually, that the way that American leaders right now are perceived on the global front is not good. We're weak on the world stage, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this, Nitsan, as well. But I can give an example of this right now. The U.S. Congress signed on to give Egypt $1.3 billion in aid recently, and then reports came out earlier in the year that Egypt was making no progress on its human rights abuses, which was one of the clauses, in this foreign aid package. You have to make progress on your human rights abuses. So the Congress voted to withhold 300 million of that $1.3 billion in aid until Egypt made progress. And then a month and a half ago, Congress came out, the State Department came out and waived the condition and said, even though it's okay. Like, it's okay, never mind. So we put conditions on our own money and then we undermined our own power by waiving the conditions. And so it's very strange. Egypt says you're playing with us, we don't actually have to make progress. If you ask me to come up with a similar example in terms of the Trump administration, I'm not sure that I could. And so I worry about that less, but I do worry about his unpredictability, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. He's also perceived here as kind of a wild card, but because
Yeah.
of the Abraham Accords, because of he has stated his support towards Israel. People, I think here, a lot of people support him, but they are afraid that maybe if Netanyahu loses his elections and he might not be as inclined to work for another prime minister. And also, we also have our own problems with people in power, and we have our own demonstrations. I don't like it when some people think, I've seen this a few times, people comparing like Netanyahu to the leaders of Hezbollah and so, I mean, it's not the same. Netanyahu is a democratic leader, even if a few people
Right.
don't like him, even if people would like to see him out of power. He's had a bit of legal struggles with people compared to Trump's current legal struggles. But this is a democracy, and he was voted into office. as was everybody on his parliament. And there will be another election. People will get to vote again. It's not the same as being under a terrorist regime, especially in regards of what's happening in Lebanon, which
Mhm.
has a government that is not Hezbollah. Hezbollah is actually one of the parties, and they took it by force.
Right.
So,
Can I ask you just quickly about the sort of public perception of the Israeli government, specifically like following October 7th? Or do you feel from an Israeli perspective that you're operating underneath a unity government right now? Do you feel essentially aligned with the rest of the population?
So most of the population really got together because you fight your external battles before you go back to your internal battles. But it has
Right.
been a struggle. Um, Everybody, pretty much, a lot of people are in army reserves, as am I. A lot of people are just leaving their families to go to war right now. So people stopped. But at the same time, we think like once the war is over, we have to have another election. Whoever wins, but he needs to get the mandate back from the people. He needs to show the people, and it might take a few more years, but we did have our internal struggles. We also have our own internal issues. Have a lot of groups talking about Israel. We have a lot of religious groups and issues, and we also have economic issues about housing crisis. I think it's really a global issue right now, like what you stated going on in the US. I know it's also going on in Europe, and it's also going on to I think a more minimal extent here, because we don't really have a housing crisis, but in something we have in common with Americans is Israelis like to own. I
Mm,
think more than 70% of the population owns
yeah.
their own. It's usually an apartment, not a house, but that's just different, and it's a small country. But people like to own, and it's getting harder to own. But it's not really, and rent is also up, but a lot of people, nobody's out on the streets. Like homelessness is not a major problem in Israel. Also because we tend to live longer with our parents. That's kind of
Mm.
like Italians. But if and we have family units. So
Yeah.
most people, yeah, they're okay. I mean, they have a place to live, but housing is getting more expensive, and people like to own. And if you got married and you can't afford your own apartment, and then it's a problem. And now also with the war, obviously, we're gonna have more taxes. We're gonna have cuts and benefits because war is not free. Some people all over think, yeah, war is expensive, but sometimes it cannot be avoided. But I really do think the thing, and we also have voices, just like the U.S. wanting to cut ties from us. You do have people here saying, no, we should just manufacture and stand alone. But you can't. The fact is, I mean, you still, even if you have, we have a lot of research and development, but we don't have a lot of metal. We don't have a lot of. We need to import the things. We need to import.
You guys are fighting a war on literally all fronts right now.
Yeah,
There's no way to be isolationist in that sort of circumstance.
yeah. Israeli isolationists are funnier than American isolationists. There's no way it's going to happen. And I mean, we can come up with the ideas, but we're better off selling them to our allies and getting back goods, and working together to pretty much, I don't know, save the free world and the Western lifestyle, because it is about more than land. It is about lifestyle. You said earlier, Judeo-Christian values. It is
Mm.
about wanting to prosper and preferring basically basic freedoms. I mean, if most Americans and Israelis like to argue about a fine tuning, like I don't think Gaza has any libertarians in it. I mean, maybe,
No, it really
yeah,
is the idea of like chickens for Chick-fil-A. Like that's the idea of a Queers for Palestine, or of a, like it's fundamentally misguided.
if you
And
don't have your basic freedoms and your basic human rights, then you can't even think further. You can't even think about personal development or what. I mean, if the government controls every aspect of your life, you don't have free speech. Without free speech, there is nothing. And you can see that in Afghanistan when the US pulled out.
Yes.
And the Taliban initially, like, I don't know why they would even do that, but they promised they promised the press, no, we won't take it back. But people will have free human rights and free speech. And now, yeah, women can't even talk to each other. I mean, it's gotten so bad.
They're not
um
allowed to hear each other's voices.
yeah,
It's really terrifying. This is a civilizational war. Like this is a battle between two diametrically opposed worldviews that will have effects, lasting effects for years to come. And so I think when you see, like, for example, when we've seen the sort of pro-Palestine um, uprising, if you will, on college campuses, it's been shocking to the American conscience to see that, like, um, that ideology can be so insidious and ingrained in our specifically in the education system and in the minds of our young people, when they're fundamentally misguided about the experience of the Palestinian people. So it's very scary. It's very scary. It's a very scary time over here. And over
also a lot
there.
of information. Like people
Yeah.
didn't even know. I mean, they didn't know Arabs had equal rights within Israel. Like people, Arab civilians of Israel have equal rights. They serve in the military. They can be lawyers, judges. I mean, I've had a few Arab bosses in my lifetime because I was a government official, and they had a few people. So that does not happen in apartheid states. Like if you went to South Africa back in apartheid days, you couldn't have a black person and then like a white employee. That did not
Right.
happen. So, but people
If
don't actually know what's going on because it's complicated.
No. And if we want to talk about settler colonialism, quote unquote, then, like, we should be talking about Tibet, which is the poster child for settler colonialism and for an oppressed people. But Israel is not a settler colonialist experiment. It is uh yeah, it really just sort of boggles my mind, the fact that we've gotten here in our sort of public consciousness.
Yeah, well, I think we can now move on to talking about really the rhetorics of it all, because
Sure.
the rhetorics of both candidates. I think this thing that just gets kind of worse every election since the social media generation. But tell me what you think. Like, is it getting worse? Is it having a larger effect on people voting? We saw Trump becoming a meme. We saw Harris becoming different kind of memes. Um, just
They're
focusing on,
They're both memes, right? At
yeah,
this point, politicians are both memes. They're all memes. They traffic in, and I don't know what sort of language I can use over here, but they traffic in bullshit, right? Whether or not they're lying is a different question. I think all politicians lie, but whether or not they're lying when they're bullshitting is a different question. Those are two separate camps. I think in terms of the candidates' rhetoric, we see from the Trump camp a sort of brasher, more colloquial, more off the cuff, more sort of like, my friends will call it toilet tweeting, where he's like, you picture him sort of sitting on the toilet and like firing off these different, tweets off the top of his off the top of his head. But I think you've also seen him mellow out significantly since his sort of 2016 and 2020 runs, where he's actually he's taking the advice of, I think, a lot of very smart people on his staff, and pulling back from the craziness that was 2016 and 2020. Kamala's rhetoric is interesting because her campaign has really focused in on the words joy and unity. And she has these sort of buzzwords that you hear her use over and over and over again, trying to signal to the American people that she sort of embodies these different traits. I'm not sure she actually does. I think when you listen to what she says on the campaign trail and compare speech to speech to speech, and compare, questions and answers, she's saying the same things over and over and over again, but the things that she's saying don't actually mean much, right? It's sort of a you've heard the phrase word salad come up a lot in the past few months since she was like installed by the Democratic Party. and that's really what it is. You're hearing her sort of use the same phrases over and over in a way that really just obfuscates her point. And so both parties are bullshitting. It's just a matter of how. And then I think when it comes to the mainstream media and what we're allowed to hear from these different candidates, in 2016 and 2020, the mainstream media was like entirely in charge of setting the how to put it, setting the tenor and the tone of the election season, and really crafting for us the sort of candidate that they wanted us to see. I think to an extent, the mainstream media has had, a finger on the polls, so to speak, in the past few elections. I think what we're seeing in 2024 is really interesting because we're seeing candidates sort of bypass that mainstream media system and go into independent media sources and give interviews to independent media sources that actually have, a wider viewer base than these mainstream media sources do now. We see them really, really dying and public trust sort of disintegrating for mainstream media. So for example, you have Trump and Shady Vance on, Theo Vaughn and on Joe Rogan, which Trump's interview on Joe Rogan has topped 40 million views now. So it's hugely influential. And then on the other side, you have Kamala Harris on like Call Her Daddy, which it was a really fascinating choice to me in terms of her campaign. But I think, again, she was appealing to this voter block of young single women, which has become a really influential block of voters for 2024. And so, yeah, I'm really intrigued about how sort of this new alternative media plan is going to work out for both candidates. And I might also add that, Harris has gone 103 or 104, depending on the number, days since being named the nominee without a formal press conference. So again, we're seeing them, really bypass the traditional sources of information dissemination and push into independent media. I'm excited to see how that's going to play out, and I hope actually that continues to happen apace. I think the fact that voters are really being able to evaluate candidates in a new way is very exciting for the American public.
Yeah, I kind of agree, but I also think there's a problem with social media being the most prominent, because sometimes it's amplifying the rhetoric in terms of the substance of what people actually have to offer. Also, like most people don't actually view, like I think on Joe Rogan it was an hour and a half. It was a very long video, but most people, they just cut out a few clips of it, and that's what they end up watching, especially young people on TikTok.
Right. But the younger people can then go back and double check, right? Like can go back and compare and contrast the clips that they've heard. And not to say that they will. And I do think that social media
they should.
But they should. And they have
stay in there.
right.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, they stay in their bubbles for sure. But I think the fact that they have the capability to do that is actually it's a stepping stone, and it's a big deal, and it's going to be like incredibly important for elections going forward. But I do concur with your point, the idea that social media is a problem, the way that it sort of perpetuates specific narratives. I think we saw that right after October 7th as well, the sort of pro-Palestinian content being pumped out on specifically on TikTok. And there are links to the Chinese government there, which is interesting and, can be discussed at a later date. The Free Press did some great reporting on the links between that content and the Chinese.
Yeah, we had a whistleblower from within TikTok Israel who gave up his comfy job, and he's also a personal friend of mine. He's really a great guy, and but he wasn't famous before. He was a TikTok employee that just came out and said, I couldn't go along with it anymore because
Yeah.
They did it on purpose. They just went along with a certain agenda.
Right.
They and of course everyone within their echo chambers on social media sometimes don't even see, especially on TikTok, but also on Facebook and other platforms, don't even see anything not concurring with their own opinions. Like
Right.
actually, I think to tie everything up nicely, libertarians, because they sometimes subscribe to many different opinions and they're not only like a single party, we see
Yeah.
more on social media because they don't actually know the algorithm doesn't really know like what my
Oh,
opinions are
okay.
just based on the content I like. I'm more of a like it's more difficult to figure out people who are not very straightforward with one candidate or the other. So
They
yeah,
can't be pigeonholed. Yeah.
yeah, and we also don't really have a choice because that's where the world's going, obviously. But yeah, I mean people focusing on the way Harris laughs or Trump's eating the cats, eating the dogs dances on TikTok,
Yeah.
then they really should maybe try to be exposed to the other side. And
Right. And then also, I mean, all of this obfuscates the actual party platforms, right? And, for the first, I don't know, was it for the first month that, Kamala was campaigning, there wasn't a party platform posted anywhere. There was no, there was no like policy proposal outline anywhere. And then when it was on her website, it was clear that it was the policy proposal outline for Joe Biden's campaign, which then they had to go in and like quickly update to reflect that Kamala was now the candidate that was running. And so I think social media, in the same way that you say that it pushes people into their echo chambers, which is true, obfuscates the important things, and makes people blind to the issues that really matter. So I agree that it's a huge problem in this election season.
so now we're going to it up to questions from the audience. If anybody wants to, then our mediator will, or you can just high five on the Zoom.
Yeah, or type them in the chat too.
Yeah,
Uh,
watch the chat. I think Anna's watching the chat. If anybody wants to ask a question.
yeah, I also want to make a point that I think in terms of each candidate's foreign policy and how it might affect Israel specifically, I think we should be looking at who will be toughest on Iran, given that Iran is sort of the head of the snake in terms of, funding different terrorist arms across the Middle East. And so that's really quite important. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you'd like to, but I just wanted to highlight that there as well.
We have a question. Yeah. Um, what? Um,
It's so foggy. Julia, is that how you say your name? Has a question in the chat. Does any one of you have an actual hypothetical forecast of who might win, or is it foggy? Well, Julia, I hope that's how you say your name. I can say that it is like truly foggy. We at this point are 3 days away from the election, and again, I read the polls at the beginning, but I'll just take you back to it. Trump is up on Kamala in Pew's national polling average, 48.4 to 48.1. So it really, really is that close. So we don't know. It's going to be really foggy and it's going to be down to the day. We potentially won't even know the results on Tuesday, but on either Wednesday morning or Wednesday night. So we'll see. I also think in terms of libertarians impacting this election, they have a real possibility of impacting things in major swing states, taking votes away from Harris in particular, because Chase Oliver is so I would say, progressive on social issues. And so if you're looking for, a more fiscally, quote unquote, conservative, it's really a libertarian approach, and a social Democrat, Chase Oliver is the way to go. So I think Harris should be worried about that in places like Michigan. Yeah, I don't know, but I don't know who's going to win. I have a gut feeling, but I'm not sure. I'm not positive.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. Who are the targeted audiences for both Harris and Trump's campaign?
Hmm.
And who relies more on Gen Z, which is interesting.
Well, I think Harris relies more on Gen Z. I think she's pandering specifically to Gen Z. I think the Biden-Harris administration was really the first administration that started bringing TikTok influencers into the White House to try and attract this really young voter base. That was really the first time that I'd ever seen that happen. I think Trump, was obviously very active on social media, but it wasn't the same access to the White House that we see TikTok, influencers have. I also think the target audience for the campaigns, this is a really very interesting question. I think Kamala Harris is targeting both young voters, as I just said, but also single women, single white women in particular, especially with her rhetoric on abortion. And she's targeting, yeah, I think probably those two camps are the most obvious ploys for her campaign. On the other side, you see Donald Trump driving around in a a garbage truck with Trump on the side. I think he's actually incredibly effectively targeting working people, targeting rural Americans. I come from Omaha, Nebraska, which is not rural, but I knew, a lot of farmers and ranchers and, um, rural Americans growing up, and he's been very effective at targeting that group. And then I think also where we've seen Harris have a real problem, which is with men, both young and, and old. Trump is really leaning into that vote, and I think has proven himself effective in that way. I also think that as you look at all of the podcasts that he's going on, these audiences are a majority male audiences, right? So again, Theo Vaughn, a comedian that not panders, but certainly caters to a young male audience, and then Joe Rogan, who does much the same. So that's interesting. And on the other side, you have Harris, who's going on call her daddy, which I already said is, a majority single women in terms of its viewership. So it's we'll see how all of this shakes out. I do wish the Trump campaign, or I think the Trump campaign, it would have been wise for them to specifically target young single women in a more specific and intentional way.
Yeah, I do think Harris' campaign tried to target men, but only men who are already Democrats. Like they don't bother, they don't want to sway anybody, but they did have this whole be a man, vote for a woman slogan thing. It was a campaign meant to say, like, if you're already a Democrat and you support our values, then the fact she's a woman shouldn't bother you. And as a woman, even if I don't agree with her, I do like that point. Like, I think it shouldn't matter. Like, if you support a candidate, it shouldn't be because they're a man or because they're a woman. It's just supposed to be, I mean, you should look at the platform, you should look at what they're gonna.
Right. Who are you most politically aligned with? Right? Like, who are you most politically aligned with? It's yeah, I think that's really interesting. I also think that we've seen the Harris camp try and sort of redefine masculinity a little bit with not only Tim Walz, her VP pick, but also with Doug Emhoff and the sort of, real front and center role that he's playing on the campaign trail. Whether or not that's a good thing, I will leave you guys up to decide, but it's certainly happening.
Okay, we have another question. Is it possible in a few words about the candidate's views about the Russia-Ukraine war, another war, a neglected war?
Yeah, a neglected war. Sure. Um, I think um I think this is this is interesting. I think the candidates are pretty aligned in terms of their allegiance to Ukraine in this war. I I know that Donald Trump would want to provide Ukraine with some sort of off-ramp so that there would be an ending to the conflict in sight. But he would also want to provide the necessary armaments and military capability to them to fight effectively. I also know that, the Harris and Walz campaign have said largely the same thing. So I'm not sure that there's such a discrepancy between the two sides there. What I do know also, though, is that within the Conservative Party, there's become sort of this isolationist bent that says, we should be spending this money, and this goes for Israel as well. This sort of conservative sect that says, we should be spending this money internally instead of both in Ukraine and in Israel. That I don't think will necessarily be reflected in the Trump administration, but again, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, so I definitely think, I mean, we should, as Israelis, try to, even if it's kind of mean sounding, um, show we have a better ROI, like
Yeah.
on investment. Like if you have to choose one, because it's really more of a partnership with us.
I think this is
I do
deal.
think the U.S. should support Ukraine, and it's definitely part of the same value war. And already Iran, as the head of the snake, are making sounds of joining forces with Russia and China. It really is kind of the major battle of our time, maybe. But
Well, and I mean, just to further your point, right? Like North Korea just sent 10,000 troops into Russia, which if we're to look at the numbers, those troops will be dead in a matter of 8 to 10 days, right?
yeah,
Whether or
because
not they continue to send troops is it remains to be seen, but we see that sort of like axis of evil alliance being formed between these countries that are really existential threats to the Western world.
exactly, and I think when George Bush like kind of coined the phrase "axis of evil," I think it was him, and people laughed at it, but it's we're actually seeing it. Um,
Yeah.
it took about 20 years, but we're watching it come to be. And also the thing about is that both Russia and North Korea, human life is a commodity to them. It's the cheapest thing they can do. They just throw boots on the ground. Like unlike us that want to avoid it if possible, we really do want to lose as few lives as possible on both sides,
And we
and
see that,
few civilian casualties as possible.
right? And we see that with the war in Gaza as well. The idea that, Hamas is using people, human beings as
Human
collateral,
shield.
as human shields. And so again, like you just said, I also completely believe that this is a civilizational war. It's a war between good and evil, to put it simply.
This is from Julia. Is someone doing something on the fact non-first voters don't need to show ID to vote? Oh, that's
Yeah.
actually really, yeah, really interesting because from a libertarian point of view, and I know some are against form of identification being mandatory. Like, for example, in Israel, it's mandatory. Like you have to ID yourself in order to vote in the election.
And
Um,
it should be. And it should
and it
be.
should be. I think it should be. I mean, what do you think? Because I know this is a part where sometimes libertarians also part from the more right wing views because they say I don't have to have any government identification if I don't want one. Like I'll just say here, part of our libertarian fight and in Israel is not only do we have to have one, it's also biometric. It
Right.
wasn't for a few years, but you have to give over your biometric information to the government. It's now mandatory. So
If
that's
you're
what
not
we
contributing, if you're not contributing to the country in terms of paying tax dollars to the federal government, then I don't understand why it is you should be able to vote in our elections. Frankly, I I also think that it's really these policies that are being proposed mostly by progressive legislators are is sort of they're they exemplify the idea of like the soft bigotry of low expectations, right? When you hear Democrats say, oh, like Black people, for example, which has been a part of the rhetoric, Black people don't have the ability to go and get a driver's license in order that they might be able to show the license when that is deeply racist. It's actually deeply offensive to sort of present that idea about that particular voter base. And so I think it's insane. Frankly, I think it's insane, and I think that it's being used, I think, right now, mostly on the Democratic side, as a tool to build a new voter base. And so, we'll see whether or not that comes to fruition in the next few years. But it's concerning. It's deeply concerning.
Yeah, she also said in a different question, I would like to add that soldier families are not allowed to buy a house if the father of the family is the only one working, because banks don't accept their jobs as a warranty for a loan since they might actually die at war. I don't know if that's true. Maybe you know if that's true. I think she's regarding the US because it's definitely not true in Israel. In Israel, being a soldier, combat or otherwise, is basically a government job. So it's one of the best warranties you have. And also, if you take out a mortgage in Israel, you have to get life insurance regardless, like all the banks. You get life insurance. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If both people work, or if only one of the couple works, doesn't matter. But if any one of them dies, then you get the
Right.
house. I mean, and insurance pays off the bank.
Oh, that's what happened Julia says that's what happened in my family. Interesting. I know that in the United States that's not necessarily true. The I have family that, is active military and was active military, I should say, and now is they're in charge of the ROTC program down in Florida at a university. But oh, she lives in Israel. Okay, great. But yeah, I know that they own property at the time of their deployment. So, um, but yeah, that's really interesting. I'll look more into that. Julia, thank you for that comment.
Oh, well, if you want counseling on that,
I
call
will.
me later because you can definitely get a mortgage in Israel on a government salary. Um, okay, so I think it's about to sum up. If you want, I think I had a fantastic time and I learned a lot from you. Thank you so much for taking the time to educate us. I hope we continue to be great allies between our countries. And I don't know who's going to win, but whoever, I really glad for the optimistic tune. I think
Nisan,
reality just dictates that some ties cannot be severed that easily.
yeah,
Um,
yes, I agree. And I think if there's any sort of last departing sentiment that I could leave with everyone, it's again, do not fear. Don't be don't fall into the desperation camp, right? Like this is not the end of democracy. This is an influential election, but it's not the end of the world. And so um I hope that this sort of last hour and a half just reinforces that the world will go on. The diplomatic relationship and the partnership between Israel and the United States will continue regardless of who's elected. Um, and um, and and also, I just wanted to say, Nisan, thank you, and Anna, thank you if you're on the call as well. I have deeply appreciated being here today. It's been an honor to talk with Lola Israel.
so much.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Awesome.